Welcome back to Water Quality in the Pacific Northwest. We're covering a set of 5 lectures on the oceans, talking about water quality and pollution in the oceans. Our outline for the oceans, we did a lecture on acidification of oceans. We did a lecture on coral reefs in the ocean. We did a lecture on mangroves. Today we're going to talk about marine pollution. So this is our 4th lecture. Marine pollution gets a lot of publicity, and today we're going to spend some time talking about marine pollution. Marine pollution occurs when harmful things enter the ocean. Examples of harmful things would include chemicals, plastics, particles from the atmosphere, industrial, agricultural chemicals. There's just a whole host of things we can continue. Agricultural nutrients, things we apply to farms, such as nitrogen, can run off the farm, enter a river, the rivers enter the ocean. Residential wastes, human and animal wastes, they eventually get to the oceans. Invasive organisms, noise, all sorts of types of pollutions in the oceans that we probably need to pay more attention to. Humans have a tradition, and the tradition is the ocean is our ultimate dump. Basically, most of the things we throw away or discard eventually end up in the ocean. As a result of that, well, first of all, for centuries people thought that the ocean was so immense, there's no way we could really pollute the ocean. The old phrase was, the solution to pollution is dilution. And the ocean was so big, didn't matter how concentrated our pollutants entered the ocean as, that they would be diluted to the point that we wouldn't have a pollution problem. Well, today, we see that there's a lot of trash in the ocean, a lot of waste in the ocean, and there are certain areas where we can go and see this waste, and it's pretty immense. A lot of this trash in the ocean moves around on currents and ends up back on the interface between the land and the oceans. Basically, this trash is everywhere in the ocean. Here we have a little fishing boat looking down. There's plastics, there's trash, there's everything. Plastics are such an important pollutant to the ocean. We're going to spend a specific lecture. Our next lecture, we'll talk specifically about plastics. So well over 85% of ocean pollutants come from the land. Air pollution is also a contributing factor to ocean pollution. Pesticides or dirt carried by the air is then deposited in the ocean. The pesticides have to come from land. They can vaporize and move in the atmosphere and fall out over the ocean. Same thing about dirt. And when we're talking about dust storms, massive dust storms, those dust storms eventually dissipate over the ocean, but that means these dust particles fall out and pollute the ocean. Much of the pollution comes from non-point sources. Nutrients from agriculture. Agriculture is so dispersed across the planet. We get nitrogen in the ocean. We don't know where that nitrogen's from. We can't identify the specific farm, so it's a non-point pollutant. Wind-blown debris. Can't identify exactly where it's from. And of course, dust. Nutrient pollution from agricultural waste is a cause of what we call hypoxia of surface waters. And hypoxia is the equivalent of eutrophication, where nitrogen and phosphorus have caused an enrichment of the ocean waters. You get a massive growth of algae, and you end up with a depletion of oxygen in the water, which results in a less desirable environment for fish. Toxic chemicals. They latch on to tiny particles, and then they're consumed by plankton and benthic animals. in the ocean. And these toxic chemicals move through the food chain. And in many cases, these toxins concentrate. That's a concern. Many pollutants steal oxygen from the ocean system and create conditions that are low oxygen, which are not ideal for fish and other aquatic life. So let's take a look a little bit more at what is marine pollution. Let's continue with some of these statements. We know that pesticides, a lot of them end up in the ocean because they run off of land. They quickly enter into marine food webs. And if you disrupt food webs, you're going to cause a lot of problems in the ocean. And ultimately, that may affect humans' food. We need international policies to protect the oceans. International policies for the oceans are very difficult to enact and to enforce. We need to worry about toxic metals. They can be introduced into marine food webs, and they impact the biochemistry of organisms, the behavior of organisms, the reproduction of organisms, and could suppress the growth of marine life. So I'm just kind of carpet bombing you with some of these things that we need to be concerned about when we talk about pollution in the ocean. Marine pollution has a long history. The first marine pollution laws were enacted in the 20th century. The first major marine laws were enacted in the 1950s. So we had some pollution laws enacted, and then the first major laws started to come online in the 1950s. And a lot of these laws were country-by-country laws that didn't really protect the ocean. In the 1960s, to try and help the oceans, dumping of radioactive waste in the oceans became very controversial. Probably the person that really championed the oceans, that really put the oceans in front of the public, was Jacques Cousteau, of course, a marine explorer. He became an international figure for the cause of stopping ocean pollution. And he did a lot to put the consciousness of the ocean problem right in front of the public. Now, we can see all kinds of horror stories about what pollutants do in the ocean. Oftentimes, you see how pollutants directly impact animals. Here's a turtle that's caught in a fishing net. Here's a turtle, dead turtle on the beach. It's caught in a plastic web. And we see these stories all over the place. A lot of the pollutants that we put in the ocean end up harming marine wildlife. Oil spills. We move oil around the world in huge tankers. Sometimes these tankers leak. Sometimes they break. In the early 1960s, we started to see the impact of oil spills on wildlife in the ocean. So some alarm bells went off, and we started to try and come up with technology that would make oil spills less likely. In 1972, the Convention on Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping Wastes and Other Matter, we call it the London Convention, was passed. You can pass all these laws, but they're very hard to enforce internationally. So to try and acknowledge how important or how difficult it is to enforce ocean laws internationally, we need to take a look at the pathways of pollution into the ocean. There are three major types of inputs of pollution into the ocean. First of all, there's direct discharge of wastes into the ocean. There's runoff in waters due to rain. and there's pollutants released from the atmosphere. And each one of these is a problem. When we talk about direct discharges of waste in the oceans, a lot of times we think of pipes. Off the coastline, you have all kinds of pipes directly discharging into the ocean. Again, the old saying, the solution to pollution is dilution. Well, if you have hundreds of thousands of these pipes, dilution may not be the answer. Dust storms originate over land, massive dust storms. It's hard to imagine how many soil particles are actually tied to these dust storms. But these dust storms move over the Pacific Ocean, over the Atlantic Ocean, and this dust deposit in the ocean puts sediment in the ocean. We already know that sediment is a problem. Sediment is bad for coral reefs. Sediment is bad for spawning grounds. Probably the most common path of pollution entry to oceans is through rivers. We have point source pollution, where we may have an industrial factory that puts out an identifiable local source of pollution. And sometimes we can regulate that on the land and do a fairly good job, but we do a very poor job with non-point source pollution. Non-point sources are ill-defined and diffuse sources, like nitrogen that we apply to farms. We can measure nitrogen in the rivers that come from the farms. We can measure the nitrogen in the ocean that come from the rivers, but we can't trace it back to a particular farm. So it's very diffuse and it's very hard to regulate. So let's take a look at these three pathways. Direct discharge. Pollutants enter rivers and seas directly from things like urban sewage discharge, industrial waste discharges. Sometimes these include toxic waste. So you got factories along the river and they're discharging. You got wastewater treatment plants along the rivers. They're discharging. We mine a lot of materials for human use. You mine inland. Our mines are usually inland. The wastes go into the soils. The waste runs off the soil, sometimes with the soil. So we erode these materials into the rivers. And a lot of these mining tailings and stuff are full of heavy metals. For instance, in the western United States, mining has contaminated the headwaters of over 40% of the watersheds in the western United States. Well, eventually that goes downstream. Eventually that gets into the ocean. So direct discharge. Our second pathway is land runoff. You get surface runoff from farming, from urban runoff, and from road construction. There's a lot of farmland in the world. We've got half the world's population. We've got almost 4 billion people living in cities. We get rain, we get runoff of pollutants in these urban areas. We're always building roads. We're always building buildings. So we've got general construction. We've got port areas. We've got channels. We get surface runoff from all these areas. And they carry particles. They're often laden with carbon, with nitrogen, with phosphorus. And that can cause quite a bit of damage. Some of the stuff that runs off our land from fertilizers, from farms, and from urban areas, they can cause algae blooms, which leads to eutrophication, which we've already talked about. You get runoff from roads and highways. They're a significant source of water pollution, particularly in coastal areas. One number that I saw when I was looking through some data was if we take a look at the Puget Sound in western Washington, they found that 75% of toxic chemicals that are put into ocean water in the Puget Sound are caused by stormwater runoff, which is basically runoff from roads and parking lots. We continue looking at some of this land runoff. Let's look at China. China has a huge coastal population, probably 500 to 600 million people that live along the coast in China, that pollutes the ocean directly through land runoff, through sewage discharge, huge urban areas, and a large industrial complex where the pollution from industry directly discharges into rivers and then into the ocean. Another pathway of pollution is ship pollution. We've got ships all over the planet. Ships have oil spills, if we talk about oil tankers. But regular ships also use a liquid fossil fuel. You get oil spills. Tankers going around the planet have ballast water. They have ballasts where they add or subtract water. When the oil tanks are empty, they add water. They use the water as a ballast that's used on return ships. They have leaking pipelines, or they have engines that leak oil, or engine oil that is disposed of down sewers. So we've seen some major oil spills over the last few years, and this has a damaging effect on the oceans. We are more familiar with the damaging effect along the coastline. So oil spills are a form of pollution. And if we continue with the ship pollution, we have the discharge of cargo residues from bulk carriers that pollute ports. I mean, there's so much trade in the world today. There's so many ships, so many large ships that come into ports. And when they come into ports, a lot of times they discharge their waste. And that negatively impacts the ocean. Then you have some vessels that intentionally discharge illegal waste, despite regulations. Hard to police. Ballast water taken up at sea by ships. And sometimes they release that water in port. That's a major source of invasive, or what we call alien species. Ships moving species from one part of the planet to another part of the planet. And it causes a major problem. Zebra mussels are an example. Zebra mussels come from the Middle East. Zebra mussels have spread into the Great Lakes system in the United States by ships. I consider that a form of pollution. Jellyfish have spread from ballast in ships from one part of the world to the others, and they've become a major problem. A lot of areas we've introduced alien species by accident through ship ballast, and we've actually measured how alien species have decreased the anchovy catch off the coast of South America as a result of introduction of alien species by what I would call ship pollution. Here's some zebra mussels, pretty famous. We're seeing them in the Great Lakes states right now. They should not be there. It was brought about by ships. Invasive jellyfish have also caused a lot of problems. So if we move species around the planet by accident, by ships, these invasive species can take over areas that were occupied by different species. These ships can facilitate the spread of new species. And when you do things like that, you introduce new genetic material, you alter underwater seascapes, and maybe you bring in a species that's more competitive, and you rob the ability of the native species to obtain food. So definitely a problem. Ship pollution. One of the things, here's a ship on the ocean. Basically, you can see some of the air pollution coming off the ship. There's balance tanks in the ship. They can be all sorts of problems. One of the emerging modern ship problems, I think, are the big cruise ships. The cruise line industry is building ships at a rapid pace, and they say 25 million people will take a cruise in the year 2020. That's a lot of ships out there. These are massive ships. I mean, some of these ships carry 3 to 5 to 8,000 people. What do you do with the waste discharge from these ships? A lot of these ships go to sensitive areas of the world. You don't want them to pollute the oceans or the coastal areas where these ships go to. A good example is Alaska. In the summer, it's very popular to take a cruise to Alaska. But the waters off the coast of Alaska are very fragile, and you have lots of cruise ships. It doesn't take much discharge from these cruise ships to cause a lot of problems. Whether the discharges are legal or illegal, they can really disrupt the aquatic ecosystem. Then another pathway of pollution is atmospheric pollution. Wind-blown dust and debris are blown seaward from landfills and from trash piles. One thing that we see all the time, or we can see the impact, is that we know that in the Sahara Desert there are massive dust storms, and we know that a lot of that dust ends up in the Caribbean Sea. So you can have these airborne pollutants from massive dust storms reach wide areas across the planet. A lot of that dust settles in the ocean, provides sediment, which alters habitat. Scientists have shown that dust from the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts in Central Asia blow across China, Korea, and Japan into the Pacific Ocean, putting massive amounts of sediment in the ocean. We know that dust storms have gotten worse on this planet since 1970. They've gotten worse because there's more farmland erosion, simply because there's more farmland. Our population has basically doubled in the last 50 years, so we've had to double our farmland. And even with improved conservation practices in some areas of the world, you still lose a lot of soil and dust from farmland. Rangeland erosion. Our meat consumption on this planet has drastically increased. And we've got animals grazing in dry shrubland, in dry grassland. They graze all the way down to the soil. Soil blows away. When you have a drought, the vegetation on the soil surface dries up, desiccates, and you end up with more dust storms. And of course, we're seeing changing rainfall patterns right now due to climate change. In areas of the world that are getting drier, you're going to see more erosion, more dust, more soil particles leaving the land masses on this planet and ending up in the ocean as a form of pollution. Another pathway for ocean pollution is what we call deep sea mining. We can use hydraulic pumps to remove precious metals in the ocean, from the ocean floor. Things like silver, gold, copper, manganese, cobalt, and zinc have been hydraulically mined in the ocean. There are some particularly rich areas in the ocean. We see that where we have hydrothermal vents in the ocean, some of these are deep, some of them are shallow, that you get deposition of these rare earth metals, and these can be mined. Well, if you use hydraulic pumps, you disrupt the seafloor. And if you disrupt the seafloor, you have a negative impact on the food web, the food chains, the benthic or small organisms that are the source of the food for most ocean species. If they're disrupted, the ocean becomes less productive. Here's an example of a vent in a deep ocean area. And as that vent's spewing out the hot water, you're getting deposition of some precious metals, and humans are trying to exploit that. So any process that disturbs ocean sediments, such as mining the seafloor or pumps sediments from mining operations into the sea, disrupts clarity, and that changes our ocean ecosystem. Okay, so let's look at some of these types of pollution in a little bit more detail. Acidification of the oceans. We've already talked about that in lecture 33. Eutrophication. That's an increase in chemical nutrients. It can be nitrogen and or phosphorus. We have already talked about eutrophication as a separate unit. It's a very important process. How do we get eutrophication started? We get it started on land. One way is to apply animal waste. Remember, we're raising more and more animals for human consumption. The waste from the animals, the manure, is rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. We often apply that nitrogen and phosphorus back to the farmland soil to enrich the soil so we can grow more crops. Here's an example of a manure spreader. I think this is coming from Iowa. Well, we put that nitrogen and phosphorus on the soil. It rains. Some of it washes off into our local streams, to our rivers, and eventually to the ocean. Eutrophication initially results in an increase in the productivity of an ecosystem, but it ultimately creates a lack of oxygen and consequently a severe reduction in water quality. And we see this eutrophication along shorelines. Here's an example. This is all excess vegetation caused by eutrophication. Here's an aerial view along a coastline where we've seen eutrophication. It's supposed to have nice blue water, not green slime floating on the surface. So the primary source of eutrophication is nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. And the source is the rivers that carry this nitrogen and phosphorus to the ocean. The rivers that empty into the oceans carrying these pollutants. And estuaries along the coastline tend to be harbingers of eutrophication. We tend to see eutrophication quite a bit here. Here's a healthy estuary where you've got nice blue water. It's where fresh water mixes with salt water. It's a very healthy ecosystem. That's not eutrophied, that's good. If we take a look at, on a global basis, there are 375 coastal zones, or what we would call estuaries, where fresh water from rivers meets the ocean in the world that are considered basically eutrophic or hypoxic. We see a lot of this in Western Europe. We see a lot of this in the eastern United States, and lots in China and Japan. Here's a eutrophied estuary. This water is running into the ocean. The ocean is in the front of the picture. You can't see it, but it's green. Definitely eutrophied. So eutrophication causes frequent red tides also. And we hear of red tides quite a bit in the southeastern United States. And scientists say that the eutrophication problem in estuaries could be mitigated by putting organisms in the estuaries that could filter out nutrients. And there has been some research trials with this, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay, where they've tried to restore shellfish populations and things like oysters. And they sift nitrogen and phosphorus out of the water and actually improve water quality, and there's some promise here. Another type of pollution that we're going to cover in more detail in the next lecture is plastic debris. We use a lot of plastics. A lot of it ends up in the ocean. And you can look around the ocean and you'll see these little floating islands of plastic debris. You have basically, it's an important source, an important type of marine pollution. Occasionally you see some really scary pictures. Here you have a fish that's about to consume a plastic bag. First of all, that plastic bag shouldn't be out there in the ocean. Second of all, that may end up harming or possibly even killing the marine organism. So we'll talk a little bit more about plastics in the next unit. Then if we take a look at the types of pollution, toxins. We have problems with toxins that leak out of our systems on land and end up in the ocean. These toxins get in the ocean and they don't break down rapidly. Things like PCBs, pesticides like DDT, TBT. So basically we have pesticides, we have furans, we have dioxins, we have phenols, we have all these chemicals that can be toxic to life. And a lot of them end up getting out into the ocean water. Other types of toxins we need to be concerned about, radioactive waste. We know they're a problem. We've got to keep these wastes out of the water. Heavy metals, particularly things like Hg, which is mercury, Pb, which is lead, As is arsenic, and Cd, which is cadmium. There are also problems. We also find them in areas of the ocean at elevated levels, and these elevated levels basically came from the land. The problem with these toxins is that our smallest organisms are plankton in the oceans. Pick them up. We're just on the edge, science-wise. We call it underwater noise. We know that several organisms are susceptible to noise or sound pollution. And some of the way we put noise in the oceans, oil exploration using seismic surveys in the ocean, naval low frequency active sonar. We know that interferes with some marine species. And even passing ships make noise underwater. Now, if we look at some of our marine animals, a lot of our marine animals don't have good eyesight, but they have great hearing. So if you start putting this noise in the ocean on a continuous basis, some studies have shown that when the ocean becomes noisy, many of the marine species, they do communicate verbally. When they communicate, they now communicate louder. This is called a Lombard voice response. Whale calls, where there's noise in the ocean, where whales are making calls, they actually communicate louder. What this does, ultimately, we're not really sure about, but we think that a high level of noise is bound to have a hard and sweeping impact on life in the sea. We know of some species that noise damage has been shown to damage. Some of these little organisms that have cilia, vibrations in the water damage the cilia hairs, and it's been shown that animals may discard their damaged cilia hairs. And what impact does this have on the ecology of the environment? So this is a pretty depressing lecture, but we're talking about problems. So let's look at adaptation and mitigation. Much of the human-caused pollution ends up in the oceans. So it's out of sight, out of mind for most of us. Main emerging environmental issue is the loss of the oceans to massive amounts of phosphorus. Phosphorus is important because phosphorus feeds the world. It's the fertilizer that's in shortest supply, and it's accumulated in the ocean. The oceans have billions of pieces of plastic waste. If you look at just these two issues, phosphorus in the ocean and plastic waste, just those two issues have a huge impact on the health of marine environments. Scientists have worried about this for a long time. A report that was written by Jensen in 2003 noted that anthropogenic or human sources of pollution of the oceans may reduce the biodiversity and productivity of marine ecosystems to the point that it results in the depletion of human marine food reserves. Basically, bottom line is our fish catch may go down because of this. Well, it's pretty obvious that we've got to do some mitigation here. And there's really two ways to mitigate. We can reduce the ecological footprint of the average human. Reduce the amount of stuff we use of the average human. Now that's kind of difficult to do. I mean, technologically we can do it. The average footprint of a human is equivalent to about 7 acres of land. The problem is that our population, as we reduce our footprint, if we reduce our individual footprint, we're still adding 75 million people to the world's planet's population every year. So we have to greatly reduce our ecological footprint to reduce the pressure on the ocean. And then we just have to simply individually pollute less. The area that we're probably the furthest behind in when it comes to dealing with the ocean and the issues is that our laws and policies are not very good. There's not a lot of international marine laws to make a difference. And even those laws that exist are poorly enforced. Some of the laws, just looking at 4 of them really quickly, in 1948, there was a Federal Pollution Control Act that allowed the federal government to control marine pollution. It's a U.S. law. In 1972, the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act controlled ocean dumping. We used to, a lot of large cities on the East Coast, used to take their solid waste and just haul it out in the ocean and dump it in the ocean instead of landfilling it. Well, that got rid of ocean dumping, which helped the oceans. It created some other problems on land, but it helped the oceans. Between 1973 and 1978, we had MARPOL. It was a treaty to control vessel pollution, especially oil. In 1982, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was passed to protect the marine environment. Its goal was to restrict the amounts of toxins and pollutants that were present. The problem is, how are you going to enforce it? You're not going to enforce it internationally. Lots of ships just get out in the middle of the ocean and they just dump everything. There are no laws. There's no one there to see them. They dump stuff. It's out of sight, out of mind, and you save money. So those are some of the pollution issues that are important in the oceans right now. Definitely affecting water quality of our oceans. We've got one more lecture associated with the oceans, and that's plastics, and we'll spend time looking at plastics next time. Thank you. Again, I forgot to put this last slide up here. The MARPOL and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you in lecture next time. And as these toxins go up the food chain, they concentrate in larger and larger and larger marine organisms and cause trouble with the food chain, and ultimately will cause trouble with humans if we consume a particular fish species that is high in a toxin. Then we have another type of pollution that we don't know very much about. Lots of beaches have trash. Doesn't matter if we're in Hawaii or Iceland, we see trash on the beach that's been washed up from the ocean.